Yeah.
Welcome to the second episode in the series of webinars on monitoring as code. For a recap, the first episode was all about the sort of the first decisions you're going to make, the things that are going to impact you from the off, patterns for how you can couple and decouple your code. That video will be available. I believe the deck's been sent out already. Everything already is available to everybody, but it's awesome. Tony says hi from heaven. Okay, we've crossed to the other side. This is great. Um, so, yeah, this is the first trans-dimensional webinar. Okay, anyway, so the this episode is all about the challenges and solutions that you're going to face, both strategic and technical. So the first half is all about adoption, that kind of thing, and we're going to move into the more technical space. Where we're talking about actually solving some of these problems with automation, with tool selection, and much, much more. Let's go to the next.
Awesome.
Slide. Yeah.
Awesome. So kind of like what we did last time, right? The first part of this webinar series, we'll be talking about more about the strategic implementations and challenges, right? That you as an individual practitioner or you as an organization, right, will be encountering as you adopt monitoring as code. And as you can see here, we're going to focus a little bit on this concept of change management. I imagine that a lot of you all are very familiar with change management, even if you haven't researched it directly, because change management, right, is all about how you adopt things. Organizations change into new versions of themselves. You bring on new tools, you get rid of old tools, et cetera, or ways of being existing. Wow, went really heady with that. And then, of course, we'll also be covering things like actual challenges and solutions related to monitoring as code or software adoption. And then, of course, we'll also have some practical approaches to monitoring as code. I know Chris has something really cool that I'm excited to see. I think it's gonna blow my mind. And then I, of course, have something as well. And then, of course, we have one more webinar in this series. There's only one more. If you guys want more of these joint webinars between Coralogix and Checkly, please let us know. That way we can talk to people who will let us know that we should do it again, because this has been really fun for me. Chris, I hope you share the same sentiment. And then we'll just keep going forward, okay?
Yeah, the temptation to be
Cool.
like, I hated every second of it was like really strong. No,
That
I've
would have
loved it.
been
It's
the
been
best.
fantastic. Really, really fun so
Yeah,
far. I'm really halfway through, so it's
that's
all good.
that's what I was hoping for.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, go for it.
So just in case anyone wasn't in the first episode, hi, I'm Chris. I head up developer relations here at Coralogix. Coralogix is a full stack observability company. I'll talk about that in a minute. I have some social links there. Follow them, don't follow them. It's kind of up to you, but they are available. So yeah, check us out. I've been a SRE for 5 years. I was a Java engineer for 4 years. I did React engineering. I built Kubernetes operators and all sorts of stuff. And my experience has kind of led me down a path of realizing that observability is one of the most important components, generally speaking, in a software engineering toolkit. And that's why I'm here, evangelizing an observability platform. So that's me.
Awesome. Yeah. So the direct opposite of Chris, right? So I'm a software development UX design bootcamp grad, right? In addition to that, my first foray into tech was building a lot of custom web applications that had very limited testing involved. And then I was a strategic customer success manager for a while for one of the most largest, I guess, test automation frameworks currently out there. And I am now a solutions engineer here at Checkly. And again, we're doing some really cool stuff with some test automation underneath the hood when we're doing things like browser checks and multi-step API checks and things like that that are super exciting. So found my way into this monitoring space, and I'm really jazzed to be here. I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Just like last time, right? Our webinar series that we're doing today is actually, sponsored by our employers. So I'm obviously an employee of Checkly, and so let's go ahead and run through what Checkly is super quick. So essentially, Checkly is a synthetic monitoring solution, right? It's one of the first synthetic monitoring solutions that has even talked about monitoring as code. is developer first. It allows you to do things like single-step API checks, multi-step API checks in beta right now, currently, browser-based checks as well. And it also allows you to do things like heartbeat monitoring. So making sure your regularly scheduled jobs are firing off the way that you expect, and monitoring things like your Kubernetes clusters, et cetera. And we can also help you build things like alerting, status pages, do some really cool things like visual comparison of your live deployed environments, right, compared to a synthetic run. And then in addition to that, we do some really cool things like data exporting, right? So this is what allows us to be really great partners with Coralogix, because they handle a lot of that metrics and logging side of things. And so while you can do a lot of this with click-based solutions, the major sort of benefit of Checkly, right, is that it allows you to have all of these resources that you're creating within version control and focuses on a developer-first approach. Chris?
Thank you. So just before I get into this, as Katie said in the chat as well, you can ask questions throughout this webinar. There's going to be a question portion at the end, but we'd like to ask the questions in the moment. We'll try and answer them as fast as possible. That way, it's as closest to the relevant material. So in terms of Coralogix is a full stack observability platform. We process logs, metrics, traces. We really love open source approaches to things like, so even our archive is stored in an open source Parquet format. So it's so open source, you could take AWS Athena, point it at their data source, and it'll be able to query it, no problem. We love OpenTelemetry. We contribute into OpenTelemetry. The idea is really simple. We don't like vendor lock-in. We don't like overages. We don't like high prices. So what we do is we make it so the cost optimization's in your hands. You're not locked into a particular vendor, and you stay with Coralogix because you like us for the best possible reason. In terms of the monitoring as code, we support Kubernetes, we have Terraform, we have a bunch of different options as well. So with that in mind, if you are interested in Coralogix, if you are looking for an observability platform and you're trying to avoid that status quo of crazy prices, crazy overages, and more, feel free to get in touch on LinkedIn or check out the website. We have free trials and you can book a demo there as well.
Awesome. And with that word from our sponsors, go ahead and move forward. Chris, I think I'm leading this one, or are you leading this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Cool. So what we're looking at, right, is actually a graph from a research, theory from the 1960s that has been made popular by a book called Crossing the Chasm. But essentially what we're talking about today, right, as far as challenges are concerned with adopting monitoring as code, both Chris and I kind of view this as mainly a issue regarding change management, right? There's always going to be a technical thing to resolve, but what we commonly see as issues around adoption and kind of being able to maintain tools is actually the process of change. So what you're looking at in this graph is the diffusion of innovation theory, right? So it's this idea of how new concepts move through stages of adoption. So what you actually see is that we're here, right? If you're on this call right now, if your organization has already adopted Coralogix or Checkly, you're part of the innovators and early adopters of a new way of doing things, right? So maybe it's just your team within an org. Maybe it's the entire org, right, that's doing this work already. Maybe it's just you and you've been, doing like a stealth POC with Coralogix or Checkly. You're here in this group of people. So a lot of what this work will actually entail for you as far as challenges are concerned is really starting to address how you can get buy-in from the rest of the organization, but do it in a way that's scalable, maintainable, and allows you to control your velocity. Chris, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, so the reason why this is really, really important to the whole mission is you at the moment when you're dealing with this in an organization, when you're in that innovators and early adopters, you're typically dealing with groups in the dozens or the hundreds. At most the hundreds, like that'd be a very, very high. And you're kind of incubating this process for growing and developing and shipping your monitoring as code process and your workflows. The second you move from early adopter to early majority, which by the way, that's what's known as crossing the chasm, As soon as you cross the chasm, the challenges you face completely shift from an issue of like pure usability to scalability. Scale kills, usability in a lot of cases. So you have to be really, really cognizant and aware of what that problem is going to be. And the reason why this is powerful is because when you're dealing with the early majority, different techniques will work to drive adoption with them as it will with the late majority. And likewise with the laggards. The laggards will always try and find a reason not to do something new. So you have to be really on top of that. And we think this model is really, really important for any new technical innovation. And it's just to highlight how early in the process monitoring as code is. But if you think about the trajectory of cloud computing, when AWS first came out, people clicked and pointed and just created servers by hand. And the idea of automation and infrastructure as code felt like needless bureaucracy. And then one day, all of a sudden, the light bulb switched on and everybody was doing infrastructure as code because they realized at a certain point of scale, it became very difficult. This is why we really wanted to show you this model. It's the introduction of scale with the early majority that drives the need for these consistent, sometimes a little bureaucratic, but definitely rigorous processes that make sure that you can scale efficiently, you can maintain usability, and it's still valuable to the company. You can do things in a timely manner. So this is really where we wanted to show you that this crossing the chasm is a huge, huge thing in the adoption of new technologies, massive in monitoring as code.
Awesome. Well put. And I guess the one thing I would add here before we move on, right, is that the way that we're looking at, this change management and a majority of the challenges that we see is within 3 stages, right? So planning stage, a rollout stage, and an adoption or continual adoption stage. So just wanted to make sure to say that. Chris, you got it.
Planning. Okay, let's do it. So the planning stage, this sounds a little bit waterfall, by the way, in the sense that you do all your planning up front and then you do all of your like sort of rollout and everything, and then you have the adoption date. It's not really like that. You're going to do lots of these little cycles anyway. However, there is a sort of fact of reality as you scale. You will scale up in a kind of linear or sometimes exponential fashion. So when you're in the planning stage and you're kind of just working out what's going on, you think about problems like scaling and velocity, but you also have to think about things like ownership. So who is responsible for the resources? Is it a central team? Is it each application team? And there are pros and cons to different ownership models. You have to think about misalignment of stakeholders. So for example, you can have the CTO is really big on monitoring as code, but their perception of monitoring as code may be drastically different from yours. And if you're the key sponsor on the ground, it's going to be your vision that gets realized most of the time. So you have to make sure that all the stakeholders know what they're getting. They know what monitoring as code is. Again, this is a very, very new thing. So you have to be really crystal clear about what this is going to look like, what benefits it's going to bring, and manage those expectations as well. So, after a week, they're not upset that they haven't suddenly halved their problem of scale in the observability place. It's going to take some time. Technical debt, I don't need to explain that to a bunch of engineers. It is the ever-present specter of problems that just the code getting old and that kind of thing. And expertise limitations is really big. So you see this a lot in SRE teams. I know many of you are platform engineers or SREs, where you fundamentally understand how the platform works or how the cloud works, and you have to constantly do what's called force multiplication of your own knowledge through automation, through self-service portals, whatever. Now, all that aside, the solutions are actually really consistent. The first, and one of the most important, I think, is automation. Automation will tackle almost everything on the left-hand side there, because even things like ownership, you can automate to make sure that everything has tags, so it's really clear who owns what. You could automate to make sure certain file structures are followed, so that it's really clear and the data is indexed in the right way. But there's also things like requirements gathering. So making sure that the right way is the easiest way is an SRE principle for you. And it's exactly the same with MaC. You have to make sure that it's easy to use. You have to make sure teams are bought into it. And just as an added little anecdote there, to drive adoption, to drive buy-in, the easiest way to do that is to get those teams to design the solution for you or to help design the solution. It gives them what's called skin in the game. So if you just come up with a grand plan and give it to people, they have no skin in the game. But if you go to them and say, hey, I've had this idea, what do you think? And they refine it, suddenly they have skin in the game. So it's just a little thing there. Leadership sponsorship. So yes, your boss has to be on board, and pricing. You have to understand how much this thing's going to cost you, understand how much Is there a chargeback mechanism in your company, for example? The different teams have their own budgets. This is very specific to the organization, but for larger companies, you have to consider these like financing models, because you are essentially saying dev time, I want to spend dev time on X, Y, and Z, and I want to change how the devs do X, Y, and Z. And that all of that has financial implications. I can see a hand raised. It might be easier if we just do the Q&A thing, because we can kind of manage them as they come through, if that's okay. And finally, iterating on the potential solution. So no grand plans followed by big releases. We're talking about like you come up with an idea. That's okay, Giovanni. You can come up with an idea, and then you go to the teams, you iterate with the teams, you develop loyal customers essentially. And what that's going to do for you is it's going to mean that you're not relying on this beautiful design you have in your mind, because plans don't last very long, and yeah, they constantly have to change. It's better to embrace that change up front. So I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Jonathan, about the content on the slide, but
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd like to add, right, or at least drill down on a little bit more, is this idea of the misalignment of stakeholders. I think that this is super critical, right, especially in the very earliest stages, is making sure that everyone's on board. If your team is going to be the one that owns it, or if you're a leader and you want to roll out a new solution, you still have to make sure your teams buy in. I think there have been probably all of us that have been a part of like a poor rollout, and you have to make sure that a solution is something that people believe in, that they want to adopt. Otherwise, you're going to face an uphill battle to begin with. But yeah, I think you did a great job here. I'm probably going to hit mine pretty quickly. So for rollout, right, this also has its own particular challenges. Like, we've gone beyond the planning stage. There's been some sort of POC. We've iterated on a solution. There seems to be leadership, sponsorship, buy-in. They've shared their requirements here. The real challenges, right, are then things like, especially specifically when you're talking about monitoring as code, are things like alert fatigue, your ability to scale, right? Maybe you thought only one team was going to adopt, and now there's 3 teams. So now there's new requirements you didn't even know were requirements before, right? Being able to execute on these requirements. It's one thing to have a list of what everyone wants. It's quite another to be able to say, oh yeah, we're going to actually be able to do all of this in an approach that's very efficient. Again, this is where technical debt will probably rear its ugly head, because the realities of the technologies you're working with, if you're relying on, hey, I really need this new NPM package to use this shiny new tool, that's gonna come up right now, right? You're gonna have to figure out how to address these sorts of things. And again, the realities of your expertise limitations will also be really, really kicking into gear here. So the way that I imagine organizations should be addressing this, and what I've seen in the field, right, is you do things like you have a rollout checklist. You make sure that all of this is documented and that you're doing this in a systematic way. It's not just, hey, we're just gonna move forward with what my team needs. You need to be able to have an idea of how we're bringing all of this together. Again, this idea of ease of adoption, which I think both Chris and I will be sharing in our practical examples here really quickly, right? Will be something that allows you to monitor a bunch of resources at a given time, like extremely quickly, right? And then again, you want to continue to maintain alignment. So as you're doing this rollout, have check-ins with leadership, right? Have check-ins with your team or other teams, even if they're asynchronous. Just try to make sure you're getting the feedback and everyone's on the same level. Respecting the scope of timeline, right? I imagine that, hey, if we're rolling out a tool, then that means we're rolling out this tool or solution within a specific amount of time. Let's make sure that we're hitting that, and make sure that we're, again, getting feedback around the feasibility of timelines to begin with. And if something changes, we communicate that as soon as we can. There's these next 2 things, right, are just practices that we should always be implementing throughout any stage of, software development, solution, tool rollout, whatever terminology you want to use here. And that's continual iteration and continual documentation, right? So as you have more teams join, they're going to have different requirements around what the tool looks like. That's fine, right? let's make sure that we are able to bring them into the fold or help them develop their own solution. This is where things like the concept of ownership will really start kicking in as well. And then of course, documentation. Let's make that demo application, right, for the organization that handles things like authorization, that handles any sort of caveats or nuances that are specific to your tool chain or specific to your technology that will allow you to better utilize the tool, but make that just apparent to everyone, right? Like let's just do our best to make sure that, again, if there's a question that's being asked by 5 people, someone else is going to ask that same question. Let's document what the answer is, and let's make sure that's available to everyone. Chris?
Yeah, that was awesome. I think in the interest of time, unless anyone's got any questions about that, just a reminder, you can ask questions as often as you like. But I think that was a really nice summary of what's going on there. In terms of the next stage, this is where things get pretty interesting. So you can imagine yourself at this point, at that point of scale, where you've managed to get lots of people into the platform, but you're now thinking about how to keep the ship going in the right direction. Okay. This is a totally different universe that you find yourself in, because in the first instance, it's all about these rapid iterations, learning really quickly. And now it's about driving certain behaviors in your customers. So things like drift, it's very difficult to mandate that people make the changes only through code. Almost all platforms have a user interface by design because it has to cater for every single type of customer. So in the case of drift, it's really all about driving good behaviors. And the way you do that is by making the right thing the easy thing. Many of these infrastructure as code resources are a little bit long to write by hand. And so automation, scripts, anything to generate resources for you is going to aid in consistency. It's also going to minimize drift. It's going to make sure that people are doing the right thing in the right way every time. So just make that's the goal there. Continual reevaluation, continual documentation, continual alignment, continual iteration. Those scripts need to be really nice to use. And the way you get that is by producing something that works and then constantly driving it forward until you get to that point. It's really, really gorgeous to use. Alert fatigue, same kind of behavioral thing. People are just going to start ignoring alerts that don't matter to them. And this is really common when people define a lot of alerts. What people tend to do is they define lots of alerts as like a safety thing. They think, well, it's better to have the alert than not have the alert. So I'll just go with it. And actually what tends to happen is you just get sick of all the alarms that are firing for you. So making sure that people are picking the right alarms that cover the real use cases they care about, that matters the most, especially if those alarms are triggering in the early hours. Versioning and change management is a big one. It's part of what I'm going to help cover as well in my practical demonstration. But the principle is really simple. If people are changing things in the UI, people are changing things in the code, they're maybe not tagging in the right way, maybe their commit messages aren't particularly helpful. It's very difficult to work out when a resource changed, in what way it changed, and why it changed. So that's really all about what that change management piece is, putting processes and automation in place to make sure that's possible. Maintenance, people think about maintenance in terms of infrastructure resource. They never think of it in terms of monitoring as code resources, because they don't see them as moving parts. They are very much moving parts, and the queries can always be optimized. Queries can always be improved. Formats change, standards change, platforms change. You have to stay on top of that kind of thing. So even if a dashboard's working okay, could that query be a little sharper? Even if you're on a SaaS platform, just making that dashboard load that half second faster really improves the usability. And as new language features are released, maybe there's a new, more efficient query there. So constantly looking at whether things can improve rather than a sort of big bang and it's done. And yeah, the continual reevaluation, which leans into the solutions now. The theme is this: we all know what to do as software engineers because we're used to maintaining and driving code changes. Take those skills and apply them exactly the same to the monitoring as code resources, but do it all the time, constantly, nonstop. And you have to decide what a good feedback loop is for you, by the way, whether it's 2 weeks that people might run Scrum, 2-week sprints, whatever. You know what's going to work for your organization, what's going to work for your team. The continual reevaluation, continual documentation, making sure that you're always on top of it. It's not easy, and it's a real uphill climb at times. But if you can get a really nice cadence that works for your team, it's not too burdensome, and it works for your customers, which are the other engineers and whoever else is going to consume that. It's going to be really, really nice for you. It's going to make a really, really easy to use platform, and easy to use means much more adoption. It's like a nice virtuous circle. So you invest in the people you've already got, and that will drive more people to use the tools in the way that they're intended to be used, rather than the temptation that engineers often have to hack and play around and see what breaks and that kind of thing. And I'll just lean into one more thing. We mentioned leadership sponsorship a few times. This is one thing that we tend to overlook, and it's the thing that kills good ideas, is not bringing leadership on board. So when you're moving into scaled adoption, find leadership people and say, look, this has already worked for these people. It's already working for them. Let's talk. You talk to that leadership person, they'll see the benefits. And if you can convince them of the benefits, they can accelerate your adoption, because they can just go and say, look, as a department, we're doing this now. And that's a really, really powerful thing to have on your side when you're driving the adoption of this. And a personal thing, team buy-in. It's much nicer to get people to want to use a tool than to force them through top-down mandates. So attack the problem from both sides, top-down and bottom-up. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the thing that you just drilled on there is the part that's almost the most interesting to me, and it's these actions that you've outlined as solutions to adoption, right? They're how you keep your chosen solution that's really great right now, really great moving on into the future, right? It's this continual practice of documentation and reevaluation and checking in with people using the solution, right? Because if you start getting feedback that, hey, this thing isn't working, hey, there's too many alerts, I kind of don't care, that means it's time to iterate. That means it's time to improve the solution itself. I love how this is so agnostic of the solutions you're adopting, and these are more about just practices we can all take to make sure that we adopt really great solutions that help us do better work, and do more efficient work. So yeah, that's perfect, Chris.
Awesome.
So with that being said, we have now reached the best and most fun part for all of us. It's the practical examples portion. I did like practicals though. Scaling, velocity, and expertise limitations are the things that Chris and I will both be focusing on in our solution. As usual, we're probably approaching this from very different viewpoints. So super excited to see what Chris has here. Chris.
Thank you. And by the way, I want to see votes on which one you prefer. Okay, these last time they were like very much in opposition to each other. These are slightly different now, so we're not head to head like we were last week. But I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Again, you don't have to ask questions, just your ideas about these patterns and whether they'll apply to you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my whole screen. My monitor is quite wide, so I've made all the fonts for everything large. If anyone can't read anything, just let me know and I'll make the fonts a little bit bigger for you. What I'm going to talk you through is, let's click this. Can everybody see quite a wide screen? All good?
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so here's what's going on. So I've basically deployed a Minikube cluster, so I'm running Kubernetes. I then deployed a tool called Flux. Now, Flux is, for anyone who's not aware, Flux is a GitOps process. Now, GitOps is essentially the practice of using a Git repository as your source of truth. This means that any changes to the Git repository are automatically reconciled into your Kubernetes cluster. Now, why does this matter? Coralogix offers a Kubernetes operator, so I can show you this here. If I go to default, see the Coralogix operators running there. Essentially what you do is you can define Kubernetes resources and they will automatically be reflected in the Coralogix platform. Now, here's what I'm going to do today. So I can see, if I open this up here, we have an alert definition already. So I have an account, I've defined a few alarms through infrastructure as code, or monitoring as code, I apologize. If I select the PromQL alert example here, I can see some details. This is a metric-based alert. I can also see that it triggers on a Friday. I'm a lazy engineer, okay? I don't want alarms to fire on a Friday. I'm busy doing nothing. So what I want to do is I want to disable this on a Friday. I want to do it in code so everybody knows how lazy I am. And so this is what we're going to do today. We're just going to change the schedule a little bit in code, but hopefully that will give you an idea of how these changes can be propagated in a way that...
I have a quick feedback here. Can you please change the layout to give more space to the shared screen? It's too small. I can't see a lot.
So is that just on the web browser, or is that on the...
I imagine it might be both if you just want to, exactly. Just increase the font on both sizes real quick. Yeah,
this is probably the last time I'm going to look at the web browser. Everything else has quite big font, so hopefully that should be okay. and I've changed this.
Yeah, it's
So
for
this
the web browser.
yeah, cool. So the web, that's the last time we looked at it. So this is the GitHub repository. Now Flux is already looking at this, and I can show you that by looking at the namespace here. If I go to Flux system, which is where Flux gets installed, I can look at the source controller. Now a controller is essentially constantly looking and constantly polling to check what's changed. You can see here no changes since last reconciliation. It's constantly looking at this thing. So we have the YAML file that represents that metrics alarm, and it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So let's just delete Friday so I can have a nice long weekend. And what I can do then, I can open up my Git Bash console. The font isn't huge on this, but it should be okay. You can see that I've removed it. Now, if I do a Git status, I can see that I have a metrics alert change. So all I do is I add this, and I'll commit, and I'll say Friday is much more pleasant. And I'll push that change. So all I've done here, there's no CI/CD process necessary, although you can introduce this if you want. All I've done is just push the change to my GitHub repository. Now, what does that mean? There's a new revision on the branch. The new revision will be reflected in the sort of Git history. The polling that's happening on the Flux system side is essentially constantly looking for new revisions and new changes. Now, what this means is that your GitHub repository becomes your source of truth. There's no deployment, quote unquote, as such. There's just simply committing to GitHub. Some of you might be thinking, okay, how do we manage branches? How do we manage tags? You can tell Flux to only look at certain tags or only look at certain branches, just to make sure you can kind of have like a production release tag or a branch. I'd recommend tag multiple branches in a Git repository is usually a sign of pain. So go for it. Go for a tag. It's going to make your life easier. So you can see here that Flux has picked up my Git commit. It's actually what this means is that it now has its own version of the Git repository. It knows that there's a new change. So now I've done that, I can look at another thing, the customize controller here. I can do here. I can see that this server-side apply has happened. So it's picked up something has changed, and that something means that there should be a new change reflected. So Flux has detected change in the Git repository. It's found there's a change to the resource, and it's applied the resource to the cluster. Finally, the Coralogix operator has picked that up and applied it to the Coralogix API. And I know this is a little bit small for people to see, but I'm just going to refresh quickly. And I will just, Coralogix doesn't like it if you mess with the font size too much, but I should be able to, there we go. I have a nice, lazy, long weekend. Fridays, no alarms, thank God. So why do I think this is really powerful? It's a really simple reason, actually. I'll go to GitHub for this, and I'll boost the font in GitHub as well. So the reason why this is powerful is a number of reasons. Okay, one, scalability. You're just doing Git pushes. It couldn't be any easier. Everybody uses Git all the time. It's tapping into existing knowledge. In terms of audits, which becomes really important at scale, who changed what and why, you have a list of commits. Make my Fridays much more pleasant. So you know that I am the lazy developer who's been turning off the alerts on Fridays. You know this straight away just by virtue of using this flow. And with things like actions and things like pull request management and checks, you can actually run automated tests on your resources as they get changed and created so that you can really check what's going on. I think this is a really, really powerful way of solving that problem. And it improves velocity, improves scale. It doesn't require any additional knowledge from the user. They just define the resources and then quite simply apply them to a GitHub repository, and that's it. And if you create scripts, you can generate the resources for them. So that was just a quick run through of how that flow actually works. I love this. I'm a big fan of GitOps when it's done well. I think it scales beautifully. It's just all about making sure that the code is organized in a sensible way. I don't know if there are any questions or anything. I will stop my share now, just so.
I'm not seeing any questions right now. I just asked in the chat as well if
Cool,
anyone had any questions. But yeah, I think this idea of just being able to define resources and then something just works, right, is awesome. I think our goal here, right, is to adjust this idea of how can I say, velocity, maybe expertise limitations, etc. And when you have something put together like what you just did, you're solving all of these problems, and you're also solving them in a way that's maintainable, that's scalable, that allows an organization to continue to grow. And if someone else wants to take on a different approach, they can. But for 99% of the users, your approach will work out of the box.
Yeah, and that's the just works thing. That's the gold. I think that's the thing that drives adoption and improves fewer questions to answer as well. You've put up fewer barriers, so there's fewer complexities and fewer confusions. I won't eat up all the time, Jonathan. I know you've got something really cool to show as well, so I'll let you take over from there.
Awesome. On the same level, we're going to look at something that does something kind of similar in a different way, right? So again, I love playing with JavaScript, and I really love our CLI package for Checkly. What you're looking at right now is an API check construct, right? So when you create an API check, what sort of attributes does that API check have? And as you can see here, for folks familiar with JavaScript, I'm actually, doing some string interpolation where we're bringing in some attributes from somewhere else, right? Where that somewhere else is, we're going to get to in a minute. But what you can see is that a lot of these attributes are actually just variables, right? And they're pretty common. They're pretty, how can I say it, simple, right? So if I'm doing something like an API check and it's a synthetic monitor, I'm probably going to care that it's activated or not activated. I'm going to care how frequently it's running. We've been talking about tags a bit lately. Wouldn't it be nice just to automate how I'm creating those tags? Maybe you can do it, right? In addition to that, maybe the only thing that's really changing between an API check and another API check is the URL and the method itself, right? And possibly things like setup scripts, teardown scripts, and headers. So that means that we could do something like this. Imagine that you're at an organization that has thousands of sites, and maybe a lot of them are similar because they rely on the same sort of architecture for from one customer to another, right? Let's say you control a login screen, and this login screen is pretty much always the same between all of your customers. So what you could do in this example, right, is create an array of objects where maybe app one, you have some browser checks pulled into it, and you have some API checks. And the API checks are pointed at URLs. We're passing in certain attributes that we want those API checks to have. So again, declaring what our resource will be like in a very basic fashion, naming that resource, passing in some assertions. But you're doing this over and over again for all of those different sites that are all very similar, or maybe sometimes dissimilar. But the only thing that's really changing is this. So instead of me having to create these resources by hand over and over and over again within a repository, I'm able to do this. I'm able to do this once, you know what I mean? And I'm able to create all of these resources on the fly. So I can do things like this, right? Just kind of like what we saw last time with that coupled approach that I showed you. We can test whether or not these resources are going to, whether or not these checks are going to work the way that we think they will. So I'm running again, something like 43 checks all concurrently, because again, any of these checks are running on Checkly's infrastructure, not on my machine. We're getting some really quick feedback that some of them have failed. I fully expected them to fail, and that's fine. We can open up that test session again to see how things are performing. And test sessions are a great way. Let me actually just switch to my account. Test sessions are a great way to actually see things like smoke tests, right? Let's say I just deployed a bunch of changes to, and I'll answer your question here in a moment, David. Let's say I deployed a bunch of changes or a change that's going to impact hundreds of sites at a time. My ability to roll that back immediately because some of those checks have failed is huge, right? So I can immediately see, hey, actually, most of those sites are failing now. Most of those requests are failing now. Let me roll back very quickly. And of course, we have really great, how can I say, like feedback from any of these text executions. And David, like you're saying, Terraform versus Checkly CLI, it's definitely a matter of preference stack. And I would also say ownership, just like we were talking about last time, right? Because if you're sitting more on the ops SRE side, I imagine you're going to be much more comfortable with things like Terraform than maybe you would be with the CLI and TypeScript or JavaScript. Um, would you recommend switching to Checkly CLI for deployments? It's entirely up to you, and it's entirely up to the team. This is a really great question. We'll share the community Slack link if you want to join there later on, and let's have this discussion. I think this is a really great question. But so what we've seen really quickly, right, is that all of these resources ran. Again, I knew those 8 were going to fail because I just haven't handled for fixing them yet. So what we can do now is also deploy those resources. And again, we are mainly just talking about this single construct for API checks, right? Like what we just saw here. But we have other resources that we care about. Maybe we want to create groups. Wouldn't you know? There's a construct for a group. Maybe we want to create dashboards. Wouldn't you know? There's also a construct for a dashboard, as well as maintenance windows, as well as alert channels, right? So we're able to create all these things through code and then deploy them through code. So in moments, right, if we're adopting this or within a few days or weeks, we're able to create a lot of resources very quickly just by applying a pattern we can use for any new resources forever, which is really great. And again, we're creating all of these alerts. We're creating all these really fun Nicolas Cage dashboards, right, that are password protected. So they're private. So I can log in and I can see them, which is really nice. But we just did all this through code. And this is how we're addressing that problem that Chris and I have been talking about regarding scaling, velocity, expertise limitations. When you can plan out what your rollout's going to be, you can adopt monitoring as code in the least painful way possible and get a lot of value back very quickly. Chris, any thoughts here before we move forward?
Other than that was awesome. Not really. I think the only thing I'd add is that this is one of the key benefits of monitoring as code, right? Where in a click and push practice, if you want to test thousands of endpoints, it's thousands of clicks. There may be some UI help there to do lots of things, but more often it's just lots and lots and lots of clicking. It's boring, and you're a very talented person. Why waste your time clicking away? So use code, use the knowledge you've got, and leverage the power of code to automate things that you shouldn't have to do manually. So this is like a really core principle of monitoring as code that enables you to be much more efficient with your time, but also broaden your search and deepen your search as well. You want to hit one endpoint 1,000 times, do it. It's very easy with code. You don't really have to rely on dodgy interfaces if you don't want to. If you don't like user interfaces, you can avoid them. Really, really powerful. So if anyone's got any questions, I know we've overrun a little bit. If anyone's got any questions about what you've seen, love to hear them. Yeah.
Cool. If not, then, like Chris and I have shared, this is a series, and we're at 2 of 3. The next one is 3 out of 3. And of course, the date is month, day, year, because that's how the dates go. And we're going to be focusing on tooling and implementations. It's going to be really cool. There's going to be a lot of really great assets and resources for folks thinking about doing a monitoring as code adoption journey, or maybe just a new software tool journey in general that I think will be really useful for folks joining. Any thoughts before we run, Chris?
Nope, that's me. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I really enjoyed this particular episode, and I think the next one's going to be awesome as well. And thank you for hanging around a few minutes after the close time as well. Really, really appreciate that. And looking forward to seeing you all at the next episode as well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Bye, team.
Yes, Aaron. Yeah.